Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special economic weather report brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand. Today I want to have a look at the really big picture for the global economy and for New Zealand over the last decade or so, and what might happen in the next 4 or 5 years, and perhaps what should happen. Because in the last 15 years, the global system of reasonably free movement of capital and of goods and services, frankly, has failed. It's failed in a bunch of ways. We saw through the Great Moderation from 2002 to 2007 an awful lot of debt that was created, particularly in the developed world. Now, this was debt that was transferred from one place to another, where some countries, particularly China and Germany, had surpluses of production and of savings, and they transferred that to countries like America and Australia and New Zealand, who had deficits, if you like, of capital and were looking for extra ways to consume. And so what you saw was this increasing specialisation of production and of savings and the move in global capital from one place to another. Unfortunately, that only works for as long as people can afford to keep servicing their debts. And what we've seen really in the last couple of years with the global financial crisis is that those economies that were borrowing to consume have run out of capacity to keep borrowing. And those countries like China and Germany to an extent, who were essentially growing their economies by subsidising consumption or subsidising production at the expense of consumption by keeping their exchange rates low, are refusing to allow their currencies to rise. That creates tensions in the global trading and capital systems, and New Zealand shouldn't ignore that. Because if we continue to stand aside, there is the real risk of competitive devaluations in other currencies that sees our currency rise, our manufacturing and export sectors destroyed, while other more nationalistic views of how to run economies dominate. So New Zealand, and we've seen this in the last week, should have to think about how it deals in this world of growing trade tensions and of competitive devaluations. What should it do? Should it just stand aside and allow its currency to rise, to see global trade flows and capital flows effectively monstrous? Or should we take some action to be more nationalistic about our position in the world? Should we look at some sort of controls on foreign capital and how it's invested in New Zealand, or how much we borrow from the rest of the world, or how our banks lend to us, or whether our exchange rate should be controlled in some way? Now, these are heretical things to say. For the last 30 years, our policy-making group in New Zealand have been pretty agreed on how things should be done. They believe that we should have free-flowing trade and free movements in capital. And we've seen that in New Zealand over the last 10 years or so. That hasn't really worked. To give you an idea, this shows New Zealand's GDP and how essentially it's fallen back to the levels it was at on a per capita basis in 2004. Meanwhile, we've added almost $100 billion in debt into the economy. It simply didn't work. And when you look at what's happened to distribution of income, particularly in the United States and in other places, we've seen essentially a reduction in real per capita incomes in the middle and underclasses and huge increases for those at the top end. And you can see in this chart what would happen to American incomes if they'd been kept at relative levels from 1979. Essentially, a middle class was hollowed out in America. Huge amounts of employment were moved overseas, and in the meantime, the financiers of these global trade and capital flows were the ones who benefited. This is unsustainable in the long run. And if you look at what the likes of Nassim Taleb is saying about black swans and the need to build in redundancies to a global trade and capital systems, New Zealand needs to be aware of that too. And that's why I think it's time for a debate about capital controls, about foreign exchange controls, and about how foreigners invest and lend to us. There we go, some food for thought. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a special economic weather report, and those are my personal views brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand.